Hey guys, if you want to learn how to knit, then you've come to the right place. My name is Davina, and in this video, I'm going to show you the ins and outs of knitting. Knitting just boils down to 3 major steps. First is the cast on. This is where we take loose yarn and turn them into neat and tidy stitches that we can knit into. Next is the knit stitch. This is the foundation of knitting. Master the knit stitch and you can call yourself a capital K knitter. Then we've got the cast off. When you're finished your knitting and you're ready to get it off the needles and out into the world so that you can wear it and use it, then you will cast off. Weaving in ends is the 4th and optional step. Basically, we take a big tapestry needle and weave in any loose yarn tails into the knitting, thereby hiding it and securing it in place. It's just a nice finishing technique that makes your knitting look really nice and professional. Totally optional, but recommended. So you'll need 3 things to get started. The first thing is yarn. A good beginner yarn should be thick and not too expensive. When you're shopping for yarn, look at the yarn label. It should tell you something about the yarn weight. Choose a yarn that's chunky, bulky, or super bulky weight. These are all thick yarns. Now, if the label's not that helpful, then look for a yarn that's at least as thick as a pencil, like an HB pencil. And I recommend inexpensive or cheap yarn because just think of your first project as like a practice swatch. Save the pricey stuff for when you've mastered knitting. For this exercise where we're just learning how to knit, just choose something kind of cheap and affordable. So an acrylic or an acrylic wool blend is perfect. These are some of my favorite options that you can get at most big box craft stores or online. I'll link these yarns and all the materials that I mentioned down in the description. Now the second thing you'll need is knitting needles. I always recommend wood or bamboo needles because they have a natural surface tension, so it kind of like grips the yarn and it makes it easier to handle, like it's less slippery. Plastic needles are okay. Steel is a little slippery, so not my favorite for beginners. In terms of needle size, look to your yarn label for guidance. Most yarn labels will include a recommended needle size to knit this yarn. So this yarn label is telling me I need 10mm needles. The last thing you'll need is a pair of hands and a can-do attitude. Now, if you'd like a printable guide that goes through the basics of knitting and everything that we're going to cover in this video, then check out the link in the description. I made this guide as a companion to this video, so you can refer to it when you need written and photo instructions on how to knit. For the price of a coffee in a high cost of living city, you can download this guide. All right, so now we're ready to cast on. I really only need 1 pair of needles for the cast on, so I'm gonna put the other one aside. I'm gonna measure out about 2 feet of yarn. And then at this point, I'm gonna hold the yarn with my 2 fingers with about 3 inches in between. And then I'm going to bring my hands together, just like this, okay? So from out, in, out, in. And my left hand just happens to be on top. Okay, left hand is on top of the right hand. And now when I let go, you can see that I've made a little loop. And now I'm going to turn this loop into a knot. I'm going to grab the loose yarn, so not the yarn that's attached to the ball of yarn. I'm going to grab this yarn, bring it to the back of this loop. So just like this. And with my fingers, I'm going to grab that strand of yarn from within the loop, okay? Right into it, and then grab the strand of yarn, pull it through the loop. And now our little loop is a knot. Now I'm going to grab my needle and put the loop right onto my needle. And I'm going to grab those 2 strands of yarn and just pull to tighten it up. That is my first cast on stitch. It's just a knot. Let me tell you about today's sponsor, Craftsy. Craftsy is your online resource for all things creative. They offer over 2,000 inspiring classes for makers of all skill levels. These classes include step-by-step instructions and downloadable resources in over 20 categories like knitting, crochet, baking, cooking, cake decorating, and many more. I'm so excited to try the beginner crochet amigurumi course. I think these amigurumi would make amazing stocking stuffers and gifts for the holidays. I mean, just look at their little faces. I can't resist. I love that the whole process is broken down in the class videos. As a total crochet newbie, it gives me the confidence that I can actually complete these amigurumis. I'm also looking forward to the hand embroidery class. Embroidery is something that I've always wanted to try, so I think this class will be the perfect opportunity for me to start embroidery. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the video description will get a full year of premium membership to Craftsy for $1.49. That is an incredible deal. So join Craftsy today and make your creative dreams a reality. So now let's start casting on more stitches onto our needle. We've got our first stitch here, which is our knot. And now I'm just going to position my 2 strands of yarn. You can see I've got 2, right? One is attached to my ball of yarn, and the other one is just loose. So we want the yarn that's loose to be in the front, and we want the yarn attached to our ball of yarn to be in the back. So first, I'm going to use my index finger on my right hand, assuming you're right-handed. Take your index finger and just plop it down onto this first stitch, this knot, just so that our knot isn't just sliding all over the place when we are casting on. So we're just anchoring it in place. So I'm going to take my left hand and go underneath that strand of yarn up front, and then I'm going to grab it as if I'm making a thumbs up sign, right? Cool. Yay, love it, thumbs up. So with my thumb, I'm just gonna swing my hand from the back to the front like this and grab the yarn like this. All right, so let's do that again. Left hand goes underneath the strand of yarn, and then I'm gonna grab it with my left hand. My thumb is gonna swing from the back to the front and just hook onto that yarn. Then with my needle, I'm going to touch my thumb and just go into the loop that's around my thumb, just like this. All right, so now I'm going to hold on to the needle with my left hand, just keeping everything in place. And now with the yarn that is attached to my ball, I'm going to swing it around from the back to the front. Okay, so let's do that again. The yarn attached to my ball, I'm going to grab it and go from the back of the needle to the front, okay? Now this is the last step, okay? Last step, I promise. Now with this loop that's around our thumb, and again, we're still holding everything, right? We still got our thumbs up. With the loop on our thumb, I'm going to slowly drag it over the needle and on top of the needle, and then just drop everything off, okay? And this is our second cast on stitch. Now it's very loose right now, so I'm going to grab the yarn that's not attached to anything and just pull down. And then I'll pull both yarns just to tighten it up, and that is our second cast on stitch. Amazing. So we're going to start all over again. My right index finger is just going to hold on to the stitches that we've cast on onto our needle. And the yarn that's not attached to anything is up front. The yarn attached to my ball of yarn is in the back. So with our left hand, we're going to go underneath the strand of yarn up front and hold on to it, make a thumbs up sign. Then I'm going to take my hand and swing it to the back and pick up the strand of yarn from the back to the front. Now we have a loop on our thumb. Now I'm going to get my needle involved. We're going to touch our thumb, go into the loop that our thumb has made, and then I'm just going to kind of grab everything, and I'm going to take the yarn that's attached to my ball of yarn, and I'm going to loop it around the needle, okay, from the back to the front, just like this. Then I'm going to take the loop on my thumb and just drag it over the needle onto the other side to the back, and that is my third cast on stitch. So I'm going to take my yarn and just pull down, and then pull down on both yarns to tighten up that stitch. And that is our third cast on stitch, right? So let's do that again. My right hand is going to anchor the stitches in place. Left hand goes underneath the yarn up front, make a thumbs up sign. My hand is going to swing to the back, back to the front, so that I have a loop around my thumb. Then my needle is going to touch my thumb in front of the yarn, and then it's going to just grab that loop that my thumb has made. Then I'm going to sort of awkwardly grab everything with my left hand. And with the yarn attached to the ball of yarn, I'm going to go from the back to the front so that I have a loop around my needle. And now the loop around my thumb is going to finish everything off. It's going to drag over the needle onto the back side and then let go. That is our fourth cast on stitch. And then I'm going to grab my yarn up front, just pull down and then pull down on both strands of yarn to tighten up that cast on. Let's do that a couple more times. The right hand anchors everything down. The left hand goes underneath that yarn up front. Make a thumbs up. The thumb swings from the back to the front. The needle touches the thumb, goes into the loop the thumb has made. Grab the needle awkwardly. Take the yarn that's attached to the ball and go from the back to the front of the needle. Now the loop on the thumb just drags over the needle and onto the back. Let go of it and then pull down on the yarn up front, pull down on both yarns, and that is our cast on stitch. Let's do that a couple more times. Anchor the cast on stitches, left hand underneath the yarn up front, thumbs up, thumb swings to the back and then to the front. Needle touches the thumb, goes into the loop the thumb has made. Hold everything awkwardly. Right hand grabs the yarn attached to the ball and then swings it from the back to the front of the needle. And then the yarn around the thumb drags over the knitting needle to the back. Pull down on the yarn, pull down on both yarns, and that is our cast on. So I've cast on 15 stitches and that just feels right to me. This is just going to be a little practice swatch, so you can cast on as many stitches as you want. Just know that the width of your knitting is going to be roughly around the same width as your cast on. So when I start knitting, my knitting is going to be about this wide, maybe a little wider because it tends to stretch out a little bit. Okay, so one thing I want to point your attention to is this yarn tail. So you'll notice that at the beginning, my yarn tail was a lot longer, and now the yarn is much shorter, and that's because the yarn's been used up in the cast on. So that's why when you're casting on stitches, you kind of have to leave a fairly long yarn tail because the yarn is going to be used up in your cast on. So now that we've cast on our yarn, we're ready to work the next step, our main feature attraction, which is the knit stitch. I'm going to turn my needle over to my left hand, and with my right hand, I'm going to take out my needle, my naked needle, which is now just making its appearance. Assuming you're right-handed, my left hand is always going to be holding the needle with the stitches, and my right hand is always going to be holding the naked needle. First, I'm going to take my naked needle and just stick it into this first stitch here, and I'm going to go in from the bottom to the top. Okay, so from the bottom, stick it right into that stitch. And now I'm going to just use my left hand to hold the two needles. And I'm going to grab my yarn that is attached to my ball of yarn, grab the yarn, and this is going to sound familiar. We're going to go from the back to the front, which is what we did when we were doing our cast on. So again, grab our yarn that's attached to our ball of yarn and go from the back to the front, wrapping it around our right needle. Then I'm going to just pull the yarn down, right there, okay, so that the yarn is in between these two needles. Now I'm going to take my right needle and just kind of like almost bend it, okay, bend it a little bit further up so that I can kind of see this little bit of yarn peeking through, right? And this yarn is from when we circled it around the needle. Let me show you again. Our yarn went from the back to the front. We pulled it in between these two needles, and now when I move the needle up, you can see the yarn right here, right, peeking out at you. And I need to grab that yarn with my right needle. So I'm going to slowly just pick out, there it is, pick out that stitch, there it is, and I'm going to push my needle into the stitch so it is firmly on my needle now, and then I'm going to just drop it off the left needle. There we go. Drop it off, and that is our first knit stitch. Now at this point, I'm going to hold the two needles with my left hand, and with my right hand, I'm just going to tighten up that stitch by pulling on the yarn. Okay, that is our first stitch. Okay, now I'm going to work my second stitch right here. So I'm going to grab my needle, my right needle, and again, go into the stitch from the bottom to the top, just pushing in, like that. And I'm going to hold the needles with my left hand. With my right hand, I'm going to grab the yarn and I'm going to go around this right needle, the naked needle. I'm going to go from the back to the front, just make that loop, right? Back of the needle to the front of the needle. And then I'm going to pull the yarn in between these two needles. Bam, just like that, kind of anchor it down. Okay, now I'm going to take my right needle. I can hold on to this yarn as well, but I'm going to take my right needle and kind of just bend it a bit, right? Until I can kind of see the loop, right here. And I'm going to slowly move my needle and just pick up that loop. There it is, and I'll push my needle in so that the loop is firmly, safely on the needle. And then and only then am I going to drop the stitch off the left needle. Oof, there we go. And that is our second knit stitch. At this point, I'm going to hold everything and then grab the yarn and just tighten it up. And then continue on knitting the rest of these stitches, okay? So let's do it again. I'm going to take my right needle and go into this first stitch, pushing in from the bottom, to the top until the whole needle is through the stitch. Then I'm going to grab my yarn and wrap it around the right needle from the back to the front, just like that, okay? Back to the front. I'll pull the needle between the two stitches. There we go, kind of wedge it in place. Then I'm going to grab my right needle, kind of turn it until I can see the yarn that we looped around right here. Now I'm going to slowly pick up that stitch and push my needle through, drop it off the needle. That is my third stitch. And I'm going to tighten up that stitch by pulling on the yarn. Okay, and there we have it. We are knitting. So let's continue knitting these stitches on my left needle. I'm going to go into the stitch from the bottom to the top, just push the needle in, grab the yarn, go from the back to the front, and then pull it in between these two stitches, wedge it in there. Then I'm going to turn the needle, right needle, so I can sort of see that little loop peeking through. Then I'm going to slowly pick out that loop. There we go. And then once it's on my needle, I'm going to just stab into it, drop it off the left needle, and that is a knit stitch. Okay, let's do it a few more times. Right needle goes into the stitch on the left needle. It's going to be tight, don't worry about that. Push through, grab the yarn that's attached to the ball of yarn, go from the back to the front, and pull down to sort of wedge the yarn between the two needles. Now with the right needle, kind of pull it up a little bit so you can see just the hint of that loop, and then pick out that loop with the right needle. There it is. Push the needle through so the loop is firmly on the needle, and then drop it off the left needle, and that is the fifth stitch. Okay, let's do it a couple more times. Push into the stitch from the bottom to the top. The yarn goes from the back to the front, wedge it between those two needles, and then pick out that stitch. There it is. Pick it out, push through, drop the stitch off the left needle. Let's do it again. Go into the stitch from the bottom to the top, push in, grab the yarn, go from the back to the front, wedge that yarn in between those two needles, and then pick out that loop right here. Pick it out. There you go. Push it through to the needle, drop it off. Okay? So just practice this stitch until you really kind of get the motion of the knit stitch. The knit stitch is really the foundation of knitting. So work this stitch until you get to the end of the row. And if you make mistakes, like let's say one of your stitches falls off like this, oops, you can put it back onto the needle, like put the loop literally back on like this, no problem. Knit the next stitch, which in our case would be the last stitch here. It's going to be tight, don't worry about it. Grab the yarn around the needle back to front, wedge it between the two needles, grab that loop, push it through, and then off the needle. And that will be your first row of knitting. Look at how cute these little stitches are. Adorable. So work the knit stitch, and when you reach the end of the row, as in there's no more stitches left to knit, then meet me back here. So when you finished knitting all of your stitches, you would just turn your needle over, just like this, and move it back to your left hand. So your left hand is always holding the needle with the stitches, your right hand is holding the naked needle. It's the hand that's going to be doing the picking and the pulling and all of the things. So at this point, you would just work the knit stitch all over again. You would take your right needle, go into the stitch from the bottom to the top, grab your yarn attached to your ball, go from the back to the front, wedge that yarn in between those two needles, and then pick out that stitch. It's right here. Pick it out with your right needle, push it through, and then drop it off the needle. And then do it again. Go into the stitch from the bottom to the top. Grab the yarn, go from the back to the front, pull the yarn between the two needles, and then just sort of turn your needle so that you can see the yarn that you've just looped around. There it is. Push it through, drop it off the needle. So after a couple rows, your knitting will look like this. Super cute, right? So now I'm just going to go over some common mistakes that happen with beginners. So one common mistake that beginners make is instead of going into the stitch, they'll go into this guy right here, right? This little loop that is right underneath the stitch, right? So they'll go in here and knit into that loop instead. And then they will knit into this next stitch, right? This is the actual stitch. Go in and knit into that one. And when you do that, guess what happens? You've now added a new stitch, this one, into your knitting. I've got one extra stitch because I knit this loop and then I knit into the stitch that that loop is coming out of, right? So I've pulled two stitches from one stitch. So now that I've done that, I'm just going to take the stitches off, unravel them by pulling the yarn. And then now I'm left with this one stitch here, and I'm just going to pick that stitch up. Okay, so I have fixed that mistake. So that is a very common mistake. If you find that you have a lot more stitches than you started with, that's probably something that you are doing. Now, another really common mistake is adding in extra stitches into your knitting by making yarn overs. So this is what it looks like. Let's just say you are knitting perfectly nicely along your left needle, and for some reason, some way, this yarn, when it should be in the back, just randomly somehow loops to the front of your needle. It's just hanging out here. You don't really pay attention. You see it, you just think it's maybe another stitch, and then you knit into the next stitch. Now, when you do this, you create a really big hole here. And you also introduce a new stitch because this yarn that just draped over our needle is now a stitch, right? So when you finish this row and you turn your needle over and you start working back again, you're just going to see this little loop and just think it's a stitch, right? You won't think anything of it, and then you'll knit into it, and that stitch now becomes part of your knitting. So this is a swatch that I made, and I intentionally put in a bunch of yarn overs into it. You can see these big, like Swiss cheese-like holes, right? This is what happens when you create a yarn over by bringing the yarn up front into your knitting and over your needle. So if you notice that your knitting has a lot of holes and it's also growing wider because you're adding in those extra stitches, you'll know that it's because you've been adding in yarn overs. So the best way to avoid a yarn over is to make sure that your yarn is in the back before you knit into the stitch on your left needle. So that is a very common problem. Accidental yarn overs that add in new stitches. So another really common mistake is dropping stitches. Now, dropping stitches is exactly what it sounds like. Instead of knitting into the next stitch, for whatever reason, the stitch just gets dropped off, right? Just like this, and you don't notice it, and you just knit into the next stitch, right? And just keep on knitting. And now this stitch that has been dropped creates a big hole And even worse, the stitch will actually continue dropping down to your cast on. So right now I'm just going to intentionally drop the stitch down the rows. And now you can just see it's like a big hole that just drops down further and further. If it keeps going, it'll literally go all the way to the cast on. So that is a dropped stitch. And when that happens, your swatch may look like this. So I've intentionally dropped a bunch of stitches here, and you can see it has a bunch of holes with like loose strands of yarn. It's not very attractive at all. If you drop a stitch, for this practice swatch, I would actually say to ignore it and keep on going, because I think it's more important that you learn the knit stitch than try to, rescue stitches. But if you do notice that a stitch has dropped off, you can actually quickly just kind of pull the stitch up as best as you can and bring it back onto the left needle. Depending on your yarn, it may actually hold its stitch shape like mine did, and you can just grab it on the left needle, put it back on. So that is a dropped stitch. Now the last very common beginner mistake is knitting really tightly. Now this is very understandable. When you're first knitting, you're nervous, and because you're nervous and you're scared things are gonna fall apart, you're like gripping your yarn, you're gripping your needles, you're pulling really tightly on your knitting. And this is something I see a lot, where new knitters will just knit on the tips of the needle. So they will just push in right here, grab the yarn, wrap it around the needle, and then drop it off. So all of the tension is really in the tips of the needle, and the stitches don't really get the full width of the whole needle, right? Because you're just knitting on the tip. And you really don't want that. What ends up happening is your knitting just becomes so crazy tight and dense that there is no real stretch to it. It almost feels like a carpet. So when you're knitting, make sure that you're pushing it all the way into that stitch and then wrapping your yarn around. So that is one way to loosen up your knitting. When you want to get your knitting off the needles and into the world, then you're ready to cast off or bind off. So we'll start by knitting 2 stitches. Now I am going to bring this first stitch over the second stitch. Now you can do this with your left needle, but I find that with beginners, they're more comfortable using their hand to do it. So at this point, I'm going to take this first stitch and bring it over the second stitch. I'm just going to hopscotch over it, just like that, and then drop it off. And now I just have 1 stitch, and I'm going to knit a second stitch from the left needle. So I'm going to go in, and here we go, just knit a second stitch, tighten that up, and then now drop the left needle and grab this stitch here and bring it over the stitch that I just knit. Okay, I'm going to grab it with my fingers and just pull it over and then off the needle and push this stitch back onto the needle. Okay, so I always need 2 stitches on my right needle. So one needs to hopscotch over the second one. So now let's knit a second stitch, okay? Because our first stitch needs a partner to hop over. So here's my second stitch on my right needle, and I'm gonna bring this stitch here over the stitch that I just knit. So you can kind of hold on to your yarn as you're doing this, just to make sure that this stitch is tight. If it's too loose, it may just end up falling off the needle. Then grab this stitch here and just drag it over this stitch, the second stitch, and bring it off the needle and push this stitch back on. You don't want that to fall off. And now we have 1 stitch, and I will knit a second stitch. This stitch closer to the end of the needle will just hop over the second stitch and off. And now we're going to knit another stitch because we need 2 to play. So this stitch is just going to hop over the one we just knit. And you would just keep going across your needle, hopping one over the other. And as we do this, you can see that we are casting off. So this is a beginner way where you're using your hands to pull one stitch over the other. If you're feeling really comfortable with your needles, instead of using your hands, you can actually use your left needle. So what I would do is I would take the left needle go into the stitch and then drag it over that first stitch and off. Okay, so I'll show you again. Just knit 2 stitches and bring your left needle into that first stitch, pick it up, and then drop it off the needle like that, okay? So these are 2 ways that you can cast off. If you are new to knitting, you're still a little bit, shaky, then use your hand to cast off. I've just got 1 stitch left, and I'm going to knit that up. Now I've got 2, I can drop the left needle, and I'm gonna bring the second stitch over the first. There we go. And now there is just 1 stitch left, and I'm gonna grab a pair of scissors, and I'm gonna leave like 6-7 inches, snip it right off. And with this strand of yarn, I need to insert it into this last stitch to secure it in place. I'll show you a couple ways to do this, but the way that I like to do it is I will grab this yarn, bring it over the needle like this. So again, I'm just wrapping it around the needle, and then I'll just hold it so it's like a little loop. And then I'll grab the stitch and drag it over the yarn loop that I made, and then just pull the yarn through, and now our stitches have been bound off, and I'll just give it a little tug here, and that is our beautiful cast off edge. I will thread up the yarn tail onto my tapestry needle. I'm going to insert this tapestry needle into the stitch and draw it into that last stitch, take the needle off, and then just tighten it up. Take the tapestry needle off of the knitting, and now we have a beautiful bound off edge. The end is tied off. So that's another way to end your cast off. So now the knitting is bound off and it looks fabulous. Wear it out with pride. Even though it may have mistakes, it is fabulous and it was made by you. Now I'm going to show you the very last step, which is optional but very nice. And that is where we weave in these little yarn tails to make our knitting look really beautiful, polished, and professional. And we're going to do that with our tapestry needle. So I'm going to grab my tapestry needle and once again struggle my way to thread up my tapestry needle with the yarn. So now it's on the tapestry needle and we're really just going to hide this yarn into the knitting. So I generally like to go down into the work and I like to hide it into these little bumps. So I'm going to take my tapestry needle and just go into one of these bumps. And then I'm going to go down. I'm sort of following the contour of the knitting. And then I'm going to go up into a bump and down into a bump and up into a bump. And once I've gone in like 5 or 6 times and I feel like it is pretty secure, then I will just take it off the tapestry needle, give the knitting a little bit of a stretch, and I'll take my scissors out and just snip off that little bit of loose end, and there we go. I've just woven in one corner of the yarn, and I'll do that on the other end as well. I will thread up yarn onto the tapestry needle, going in 5 or 6 times. And if it looks good to you and it feels pretty secure, then I think you can just cut it off. There's no loose yarn attached to my knitting anymore, and it looks fabulous. And this is how you knit, from casting on to casting off and weaving in your ends. We've reached the end of this video. Now, if you've managed to knit a knit stitch, then congratulations, you are a capital K knitter. Be very proud of yourself, give yourself a pat on the back. Now remember that knitting is a journey, and you're just at the beginning of it. So you will make mistakes, but embrace them, learn from them, and you will get better. Practice makes perfect. I really believe that. I'm Davina from sheepandstitch.com. Thank you so much for watching and letting me show you what knitting is all about. It's been an absolute blast. Happy knitting, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.